It was just another sunny day in the quiet little neighborhood of Maple Grove, or so everyone thought. The birds were singing, the lawns were green, and the air smelled like fresh cut grass. Kids rode their bikes up and down the street, laughing and shouting. Old Mr. Thompson sat on his porch, sipping lemonade. Everything seemed perfect. But no one knew the truth about Tim Jenkins. To most people, Tim was just the friendly guy next door. You know the type, the one who always has a big smile on his face, the one who waves hello to everyone, even if he's in a hurry. Every Saturday, like clockwork, Tim would mow his lawn. The hum of his lawnmower was as regular as the sunrise. Neighbors would see him pushing it back and forth, wearing his old blue baseball cap, and they'd think, "Good old Tim. He's so nice. So normal." But Tim wasn't normal. Not at all. Tim had a secret. A big, juicy secret that was about to turn his sleepy little street upside down. What kind of secret, you ask? Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Secrets are like presents, you don't open them all at once. You have to wait, peel back the wrapping paper slowly, and enjoy the surprise. And trust me, Tim's secret was a surprise no one saw coming. Now, let's talk about Tim's garden. Oh, his garden. It wasn't just any garden. It was his pride and joy, the thing he loved most in the world. Tim's front yard was like a magical land. There were bright red roses that smelled so sweet, you'd want to sniff them all day. There were yellow daisies that bobbed their heads in the breeze, like they were saying hello. There was a tiny fountain in the middle, shaped like a frog, that bubbled and splashed all day long. Kids loved to watch the water shoot out of the frog's mouth and giggle. But the best part of Tim's garden, the part he loved most of all, was a goofy-looking garden gnome named Gary. Gary wasn't just any gnome. He was special. Gary was about 2 feet tall, with a pointy red hat that flopped over to one side. He had a big, cheeky grin on his face, like he was up to some kind of mischief. His cheeks were painted bright pink, and his little black boots shone in the sun. In his hand, Gary held a tiny shovel, like he was ready to dig up some fun. Tim thought Gary was the best. Every morning, Tim would walk outside, pat Gary on the head, and say, "Good morning, buddy. Keep an eye on the garden for me, okay?" It was like Gary was his little helper, his garden guardian. When Tim looked at Gary, he couldn't help but smile. Gary made the garden feel alive, like it had its own personality. But not everyone agreed. Oh no, not at all. There was one person in Maple Grove who didn't like Gary. Not one bit. And that person was Linda Harper. Now, let me tell you about Linda. Linda wasn't just any neighbor. She was the head of the Maple Grove Homeowners Association, or as Tim secretly called her, HOA Karen. What's an HOA, you ask? Well, it's a group of people who make rules for the neighborhood. Rules like, your grass can't be too tall, or your mailbox has to be a certain color. The idea is to keep the neighborhood looking nice. But Linda took those rules way too seriously. Linda was the kind of neighbor who would measure your grass with a ruler to make sure it wasn't even 1 inch too tall. If it was, you'd get a nasty letter in your mailbox, written in big, angry red letters. Linda was the kind of neighbor who would knock on your door and yell at you if your mailbox wasn't the right shade of blue. "It's not sky blue, it's ocean blue," she'd shout, waving her rulebook in the air. And Linda was the kind of neighbor who would peek out her window, watching everyone, just waiting for someone to break a rule so she could pounce. And guess what? Linda hated Tim's garden gnome. Hated it with a capital H. Every time she walked by Tim's house, she'd stop, put her hands on her hips, and glare at Gary. Her nose would wrinkle up, like she smelled something bad. Her eyes would narrow, like she was trying to shoot laser beams at the poor little gnome. Sometimes, Tim would catch her muttering under her breath, saying things like, "That ugly thing. It's ruining the neighborhood." Tim didn't understand it. Why did Linda care so much about a little garden gnome? Gary wasn't hurting anyone. He wasn't making noise. He wasn't breaking any big rules. But Linda acted like Gary was the worst thing to ever happen to Maple Grove. She'd even started leaving notes on Tim's doorstep, written in her big, angry handwriting. One note said, "Garden decorations must be approved by the HOA. Remove this ugly statue immediately." Tim just laughed when he read it. "Ugly," he said to himself, shaking his head. "Gary's the star of my garden. He's not going anywhere. But deep down, Tim was starting to get annoyed. Why couldn't Linda just leave him alone? Why did she have to make such a big deal out of everything? What Linda didn't know, what no one in Maple Grove knew, was that Tim wasn't just a friendly guy with a nice garden. Tim had a secret. A secret that was going to change everything. And it all started with that goofy little gnome named Gary. Before I go on, quick question for you: have you ever had a neighbor like Linda? Someone who just couldn't leave you alone? Drop your stories in the comments, and don't forget to smash that like button if you're already hooked. Linda had been after Tim for weeks. It all started the day she first saw Gary, the goofy garden gnome, sitting proudly in Tim's front yard. Every time she walked by his house, she'd stop dead in her tracks. Her feet would freeze on the sidewalk, her hands would fly to her hips, and she'd glare at Gary like he was the worst thing in the world. Her eyes would squint so hard, you'd think she was trying to burn a hole right through him. And then, she'd mutter something under her breath, mean, grumpy words that Tim couldn't quite hear but could definitely feel. Words like ugly, awful, and disgrace. Tim didn't get it. Gary was just a little gnome, after all. He wasn't loud. He wasn't messy. He wasn't even big. He was just a happy little guy with a red hat, a cheeky grin, and a tiny shovel, sitting quietly among the flowers. But to Linda, Gary was a monster. A monster that needed to go. One day, things got worse. Tim woke up early, like he always did, to water his flowers. He stepped outside, his watering can in hand, and saw something on his doorstep. It was a note, folded neatly and taped right to the middle of his welcome mat. Tim picked it up, unfolded it, and read the big, angry words written in bright red marker: "Garden decorations must be approved by the HOA. Remove this ugly statue immediately." Tim stared at the note, his eyebrows shooting up. "Ugly," he said out loud, turning to look at Gary. Gary just sat there, grinning as always, his little shovel shining in the morning sun. "Gary, ugly? No way. You're the star of my garden," Tim said, laughing to himself. He crumpled up the note and tossed it into the trash can by his garage. Linda's just being silly, he thought. She'll get over it. But Linda wasn't being silly. And she definitely wasn't going to get over it. The very next day, Tim was in his garden, pulling a few weeds, when he heard a loud, sharp knock on his front door. Bang, bang, bang. It sounded like someone was trying to break the door down. Tim stood up, brushed the dirt off his hands, and walked over to see who it was. When he opened the door, there stood Linda, her face red and her eyes blazing. In one hand, she held her big, heavy HOA rule book, the one she carried everywhere like it was a superhero's shield. In the other hand, she held a pen, which she was waving around like a sword. "Tim Jenkins," she yelled, her voice so loud it made the birds in the trees fly away. "You need to take that ugly gnome down right now. It's against the rules." Tim blinked. He looked at Linda, then back at Gary, then back at Linda again. "Rules," he said, tilting his head. "What rules?" Linda's face turned even redder, if that was possible. She flipped open her rule book, her fingers moving so fast the pages almost tore. "Here," she shouted, pointing to a line on the page. "Rule number 47, Section B, all garden decorations must be approved by the HOA board. That gnome is not approved. It's breaking the rules, and it's ruining the neighborhood." Tim stayed calm, even though Linda was yelling so loud his ears hurt. He put on his biggest, friendliest smile and said, "Linda, it's just a gnome. It's not hurting anyone. Let's not make a big deal out of it, okay?" But inside, Tim was starting to get annoyed. He worked hard on his garden. Every flower, every bush, every blade of grass, he took care of it all. He spent hours planting, watering, and weeding, just to make his yard look nice. And Gary? Gary was the cherry on top, the little touch that made the garden feel special. Why was Linda so mean about it? Why couldn't she just leave him alone? Linda didn't stop, though. Oh no. She kept coming back, day after day, knocking on Tim's door, leaving more notes, and yelling about rules. One afternoon, Tim was outside fixing his frog fountain when Linda marched up to his yard, her rulebook in hand. "Tim," she barked, pointing at Gary. "I've told you 100 times that gnome has to go. If you don't take it down, I'll make sure the HOA finds you. You'll have to pay money, Tim. Lots of money. Tim looked up from his fountain, a little drop of water dripping from his nose. He wiped it away, stood up straight, and said, Linda, I'm not taking Gary down. He's part of my garden, and I like him. Why don't you go measure someone else's grass or something? Linda's mouth fell open. She wasn't used to people talking back to her. She huffed, puffed, and stomped away, muttering, You'll be sorry, Tim Jenkins. You'll be sorry. Tim watched her go, shaking his head. What's her problem, he thought. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Linda wasn't the kind of person to give up. She was like a dog with a bone. Once she got an idea in her head, she wouldn't let go. And her idea right now was to get rid of Gary, no matter what it took. What Linda didn't know, though what no one in Maple Grove knew, was that Tim wasn't just any ordinary gardener. Tim wasn't just a nice guy who mowed his lawn and waved hello. Tim had a hidden talent. A special skill. A secret power that was about to teach Linda a lesson she'd never forget. See, Tim wasn't afraid of Linda's yelling or her rulebook or her threats. While Linda thought she was the boss of the neighborhood, Tim was watching. Tim was listening. Tim was waiting. And soon, very soon, Linda was going to find out that picking on Tim and picking on Gary was the biggest mistake she'd ever made. Days turned into weeks, and Linda's complaints about Gary the gnome got louder and louder. It was like she had made it her mission to get rid of him, no matter what. Every morning, Tim would wake up, step outside to water his flowers, and see Linda marching up and down the street, her face all scrunched up and angry. She wasn't just complaining to Tim anymore, she was trying to get everyone else in Maple Grove on her side, too. Linda started taking pictures of Gary. She'd stand right in front of Tim's garden, holding up her phone, snapping photo after photo. Click, click, click. The sound was so annoying, it made Tim's ears hurt. Then, she'd send those pictures to the HOA board, the group that made the neighborhood rules. Look at this, she'd write in big, angry emails. This gnome is breaking all the rules. We have to do something. Linda didn't stop there, though. She started talking to the other neighbors, knocking on their doors, waving her rulebook around like it was a magic wand. That gnome is an eyesore, she'd say, her voice loud and sharp. It's ugly. It's ruining our beautiful neighborhood. We can't let people break the rules like this. But here's the thing, most of the neighbors didn't care. Not one bit. They liked him. He was the guy who always smiled, the guy who helped Mrs. Carter carry her groceries, the guy who gave out extra candy on Halloween. And Gary? They thought Gary was funny. It's just a little gnome, Mr. Thompson said, sipping his lemonade on his porch. What's the big deal? Yeah, said Jenny, the girl who lived across the street. I think Gary's cute. He makes me laugh when I ride my bike past Tim's house. But Linda wouldn't give up. Oh no. She was like a bulldog. Once she got her teeth into something, she wouldn't let go. One afternoon, Tim was sitting by his living room window, sipping a glass of iced tea, when he saw something strange. Linda was standing right in front of his house, right by his garden, but she wasn't taking pictures this time. She was holding a little notebook, the kind you use to write down secrets. She was scribbling in it, her pen moving fast, and she kept looking around, like she didn't want anyone to see her. Tim watched from his window, his eyes narrowing. What's she planning now, he wondered. Linda looked sneaky, like a fox creeping through the woods, up to no good. She'd glance at Gary, then write something down, then glance at Gary again, then write some more. It was like she was making a big, secret plan, and Tim had a feeling it wasn't a nice one. But here's the thing, Linda didn't know Tim wasn't just watching her. Oh no. Tim was gathering information, too. See, Tim wasn't only a gardener, the guy who loved his flowers and his goofy gnome. Tim was also a private investigator. What's that, you ask? Well, it's like a detective, but secret. A private investigator is someone who solves mysteries, finds clues, and catches bad guys, all without anyone knowing. And Tim was really, really good at it. Tim had a hunch, a funny feeling in his tummy that Linda wasn't as perfect as she pretended to be. Sure, she acted like she was the queen of Maple Grove, always telling everyone what to do, always waving her rulebook around. But Tim thought there was more to Linda than that. Something sneaky. Something not so nice. And he was going to find out what. Each day, Tim started noticing more strange things. Little things, at first, but they added up, like pieces of a puzzle. One night, when it was dark and the stars were twinkling, Tim saw Linda's car pulling into her driveway. But it wasn't the usual time people come home, like after work or after the grocery store. It was super late, way past bedtime, when everyone else in Maple Grove was asleep. Tim peeked out his window, rubbing his sleepy eyes, and watched as Linda got out of her car. She wasn't alone, though. There was a big, dark van parked right behind her car, and a man in a black cap climbed out of it. Linda and the man opened the back of the van, and guess what? They started carrying big boxes into Linda's garage. Not little boxes, like the kind you get in the mail. Big boxes, so heavy they had to use both hands to carry them. And they were sneaky about it, too, looking around, making sure no one was watching. Tim watched, his eyebrows shooting up. What's in those boxes, he wondered. And why is Linda being so sneaky? Another day, Tim saw something even weirder. It was early in the morning, when the sun was just starting to peek over the trees. A delivery man came to Linda's house, carrying a big package. But when he knocked on her door, Linda didn't look happy to see him. Oh no. She opened the door, stepped outside, and started yelling. Don't tell anyone about this, she shouted, her voice sharp and mean. This is private. Do you understand? The delivery man looked scared. He nodded quickly, handed her the package, and ran back to his truck, driving away as fast as he could. Tim, who was watering his flowers, saw the whole thing. He thought, tapping his chin. That's not normal. Something's not right. That's when Tim decided he needed to do more than just watch. He needed to investigate. He went inside, grabbed a little notebook of his own, the kind private investigators use, and started writing down everything he saw. Every strange car, every late-night box, every sneaky delivery. Something's not right, he thought, his pen scratching across the paper. And I'm going to find out what. Tim was patient. He was careful. He didn't want Linda to know he was watching her. But every day, he added more clues to his notebook, like a detective building a case. And every day, he got a little closer to figuring out Linda's secret, a secret that was going to turn Maple Grove upside down. One bright morning, the sun was shining high in the sky, and the birds were singing their happy songs. Tim was outside in his garden, just like always. He had his watering can in one hand, sprinkling water on his bright red roses and his yellow daisies. The little frog fountain bubbled and splashed, and Gary the gnome sat proudly in the middle of it all, his red hat shining in the sunlight, his cheeky grin as big as ever. It was a perfect day, or so Tim thought. Then, all of a sudden, Tim heard a loud, angry voice. It was Linda. She was standing right in the middle of his driveway, her phone pressed tight against her ear. Her face was red, her eyes were blazing, and she was shouting so loud, Tim was sure the whole neighborhood could hear her. Yes, hello, 911? I need the police right now, she yelled into the phone. There's an illegal statue in my neighbor's yard. It's a safety hazard, and I demand you remove it. Tim froze, his watering can still in his hand, a few drops of water dripping onto his sneakers. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. She's calling the cops on Gary, he said out loud, his eyebrows shooting up so high they almost touched his hair. On my little gnome? Is she serious? Tim looked over at Gary, who just sat there, grinning as always, his little shovel in his hand. Tim couldn't help it, he started to laugh. The idea of calling the police on a garden gnome was so silly, so ridiculous, that it felt like a big joke. Oh, Linda, Tim said, shaking his head. You've really lost it this time. But Linda wasn't laughing. Oh no. She was dead serious. She kept shouting into the phone, waving her free hand in the air like she was swatting at invisible flies. Yes, it's an emergency, she barked. This gnome is breaking all the HOA rules. It's dangerous. Someone could trip over it. You need to come right now and take it away. Tim watched her, his laughter fading a little. He was starting to feel annoyed again. She's really doing this, he thought. She's really calling the police over a little gnome. What's wrong with her? But before Tim could say anything, before Linda could even finish her call, something amazing happened. Something totally unexpected. Something that made Tim's jaw drop wide open. Two police cars pulled into the neighborhood, their lights flashing red and blue. The tires squealed a little as they stopped right on the street, just a few feet from Tim's house. The doors opened, and 4 police officers stepped out, their badges shining in the sunlight. Linda saw them, and a big, smug smirk spread across her face. She hung up her phone, crossed her arms over her chest, and said, "Finally, justice." Linda thought the police were there for Tim. She thought they were there to take Gary away, to punish Tim for breaking her precious HOA rules. She stood there, her nose in the air, looking proud and happy, like she had just won a big prize. "See, Tim," she said, turning to him with a sneer. "I told you I'd win. The police are here to fix this mess. Say goodbye to your ugly gnome." Tim didn't say a word. He just stood there, his watering can still in his hand, watching. But deep down, he wasn't worried. Not one bit. Because Tim knew something Linda didn't. Something big. Something that was about to turn her whole world upside down. The police officers didn't go to Tim's house. They didn't even look at Gary. Instead, they walked straight past Tim's garden, straight past Linda, and right up to Linda's front door. One of the officers, a tall man with a serious face, knocked hard on the door. Bang, bang, bang. The sound echoed through the quiet neighborhood. "Linda Harper," the officer said in a loud, clear voice. "We have a warrant to search your property." Linda's face changed in an instant. Her smug smirk disappeared, like someone had wiped it off with a big eraser. Her mouth fell open, her eyes went wide, and her face turned pale, as white as a sheet. "What?" she stammered, her voice shaking. "A warrant? To search my property? This is outrageous. I'm the head of the HOA. You can't do this." But the officers didn't care. They didn't even look at her. The tall officer held up a piece of paper, the warrant, and said, "Step aside, ma'am. We have work to do." The other officers pushed past Linda, walked right into her house, and started looking around. Linda stood there, frozen, her hands shaking, her eyes darting back and forth like she didn't know what to do. Tim watched all of this, his jaw dropping wide open. But then, a big grin started to spread across his face. He put down his watering can, wiped his hands on his jeans, and walked over to the edge of his driveway, where he could see everything. A few minutes later, the officers came back out of Linda's house, and guess what they were carrying? Those big, mysterious boxes, the ones Tim had seen Linda sneaking into her garage late at night. The tall officer opened one of the boxes, peeked inside, and nodded to the others. "Just like we thought," he said. "Stolen goods." Linda's face turned even paler, if that was possible. "Stolen goods," she squeaked, her voice high and shaky. "What are you talking about? Those are mine. You have no right." But Tim wasn't surprised. Not one bit. He stepped forward, his grin growing bigger, and said, "Oh, Linda." He shook his head, like a teacher disappointed in a naughty student. "You thought you could bully me, didn't you? You thought you could yell at me, threaten me, and call the police on my little gnome. But you didn't know I've been watching you. Those boxes? They're full of stolen goods. I've been investigating you for weeks, and I tipped off the police." Linda's eyes widened in shock, so big they looked like they might pop out of her head. "You," she stammered, pointing a shaky finger at Tim. "Ain't nobody like you. You're just a gardener. A silly man with a silly gnome." Tim just shrugged, his grin never fading. "I'm not a nobody," he said calmly. "I'm a private investigator. And you, Linda, are under arrest." The tall officer stepped forward, pulling a pair of shiny handcuffs from his belt. "Linda Harper," he said, "you're under arrest for theft and fraud." The cuffs clicked around Linda's wrists, and she let out a loud, angry yell. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "I'm the head of the HOA. I make the rules." But the officers didn't listen. They led her to the police car, opened the door, and helped her inside. Linda kept yelling, but no one paid attention. The whole neighborhood was watching now, Mr. Thompson on his porch, Jenny on her bike, Mrs. Carter peeking out her window. And Tim? Tim just stood there, smiling, with Gary the gnome grinning right beside him. As the police handcuffed Linda and led her to the squad car, the whole neighborhood came alive. Neighbors stepped out of their houses, gathering on their lawns, whispering and pointing. Kids stopped riding their bikes and stared. Even old Mr. Thompson put down his lemonade and leaned forward on his porch to get a better look. Everyone was shocked. "I can't believe it," Mrs. Carter said, her eyes wide. Linda was stealing from the HOA fund all this time. It turned out, Linda had been up to no good for a long time. She wasn't just a mean neighbor who yelled about rules, she was a thief. As the head of the HOA, she was in charge of the neighborhood budget, the money everyone paid to keep the streets clean and the parks nice. But Linda had been sneaky. She'd been using that money to buy expensive things, like fancy jewelry, big TVs, and even a shiny new car, and hiding them all in her garage. Those big, mysterious boxes? They were full of stuff she stole. But thanks to Tim's detective work, the police had all the proof they needed. Tim had watched Linda, taken notes, and gathered clues, like a real-life superhero. He'd even taken pictures of the delivery vans and the boxes, and he'd called the police to tell them everything. Now, Linda was caught, and she couldn't wiggle her way out of it. The police car drove away, its lights flashing, with Linda sitting in the back, yelling and complaining. But no one listened. The neighbors turned to Tim, who was standing by his garden, right next to Gary the gnome. "Tim, you're amazing," Jenny said, clapping her hands. "You caught her." Tim just smiled, patting Gary's red hat. "I couldn't let her bully me or Gary," he said. "Sometimes, you have to stand up for what's right." The very next day, the HOA held an emergency meeting. Everyone in the neighborhood showed up, crowding into the community center, sitting on chairs and standing in the back. The room was buzzing with chatter. "We need a new leader," Mr. Thompson said, standing up. "Linda's gone, and we need someone honest, someone brave." All the neighbors turned to look at Tim, who was sitting quietly in the front row. "Tim, you should be the new head of the HOA," Mrs. Carter said, smiling. "You've shown us what it means to stand up for what's right. You caught Linda and saved our neighborhood." Everyone cheered, clapping and shouting, "Tim! Tim! Tim!" But Tim just shook his head, his cheeks turning a little pink. "Thanks, everyone," he said, standing up. "I'm happy to help, but I don't want to be in charge. I'll stick to gardening." "Oh, and Gary's staying right where he is." The neighbors laughed and cheered even louder. "Gary stays! Gary stays!" they shouted. And from that day on, no one ever complained about Tim's garden gnome again. Gary sat proudly in the garden, his red hat shining, his grin as big as ever, and the whole neighborhood loved him just like they loved Tim. So, there you have it, folks, the wild story of Tim, Gary the gnome, and the HOA Karen who got what she deserved. Wasn't that a crazy ride? We saw Tim, the quiet gardener, stand up to Linda, the mean neighbor who thought she could boss everyone around. We saw Gary, the little gnome with the big grin, stay right where he belonged, shining in the garden. And we saw Linda, the bully, learn a big lesson: don't mess with the wrong person. But this story isn't just about a gnome or a nosy neighbor. Oh no. It's about something much bigger. It's about power, fairness, and standing up for what's right. Let's think about it for a minute. Tim seemed like just a regular guy, didn't he? He mowed his lawn, watered his flowers, and waved hello to everyone. He was quiet, friendly, and didn't make a big fuss. But guess what? Sometimes, the quietest person on the street is the one with the most power. Think about it like this: imagine you're at school, and there's a kid in your class who doesn't talk a lot. Maybe they sit in the back, reading a book, while everyone else is running around, shouting, and playing. You might think, oh, that kid's just shy. They don't do much. But what if that kid is secretly really good at something? Maybe they're amazing at solving puzzles, or they're super brave, or they know how to help people when they're sad. You'd never know, would you? Because they don't show off. They don't brag. They just wait for the right moment to shine. That's what Tim was like. Linda thought he was a nobody, just a silly gardener with a silly gnome. She judged him by how he looked: quiet, ordinary, easy to pick on. But she was wrong. Big time wrong. Tim wasn't ordinary at all. He was a private investigator, a detective who solved mysteries and caught bad guys. He had power, but he didn't use it to be mean or bossy, like Linda did. He used it to help his neighborhood, to protect his garden, and to make things fair. And those who judge others, well, they're the ones who never see it coming. Linda thought she was so smart, didn't she? She thought she could yell, threaten, and make rules to get her way. She thought she could scare Tim into taking Gary down. But she didn't know the truth about Tim. She didn't know he was watching her, gathering clues, and waiting for the perfect moment to show everyone who she really was: a thief, a bully, a sneak. This happens in real life, too, you know. Bullies like Linda think they're big and strong because they're loud, because they make others feel small. But guess what? Being loud doesn't make you strong. Being mean doesn't make you powerful. Real strength is being brave, like Tim was. Real power is standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Let me tell you a little story to help you understand. Imagine you're at the playground, and there's a kid who's always pushing others around. Let's call him Max. Max is big, loud, and mean. He takes the swings from the little kids, laughs when someone falls, and says, "I'm the boss of the playground." Everyone's scared of Max, so they let him do whatever he wants. But then, there's another kid, let's call her Sarah. Sarah's small, quiet, and doesn't say much. She just watches Max, day after day, seeing how he treats everyone. One day, Max tries to take Sarah's turn on the slide. "Get out of my way," he yells. But Sarah doesn't move. She looks at him, calm and steady, and says, "No. It's my turn, and you need to wait." Max laughs, thinking Sarah's weak because she's small. But what Max doesn't know is that Sarah's been talking to the teachers, telling them about Max's bullying. She's been helping the little kids feel safe, teaching them to stick together. And that day, when Max tries to push her, the teachers come over, thanks to Sarah's bravery, and Max gets in big trouble. See? Sarah was quiet, but she was strong. Max judged her, but he was wrong. Just like Linda judged Tim, and just like Linda was wrong. So, what can we learn from Tim's story? A lot. First, we learn that you should never judge someone by how they look or act. Just because someone's quiet, or small, or doesn't show off, doesn't mean they're weak. They might be the strongest person you know. Second, we learn that standing up for what's right is important, even if it's hard. Tim could have taken Gary down to make Linda happy, but he didn't. He fought for what he loved, and he won. And third, we learn that bullies don't always win. Justice always finds a way, just like it did for Linda. Now, I want you to think about your own life. Have you ever met someone like Linda? Maybe a bully at school, or a kid who's mean to others, or even an adult who thinks they can boss everyone around. What would you do if you were Tim? Would you stay quiet, or would you be brave, like he was? Here's a tip: be like Tim. Be patient, be smart, and be kind. If someone's being mean, don't fight fire with fire. Don't yell or cry or give up. Instead, watch, listen, and think. Find a way to stand up for what's right, even if it takes time. Maybe you tell a teacher, or help a friend, or stick up for someone smaller than you. Whatever you do, remember you have power, just like Tim did. And that power is strongest when you use it to help others. Before I go, let me know in the comments, what would you do if you had a neighbor like Linda? Would you fight for your garden gnome, or come up with a sneaky plan, or maybe talk to the neighbors to get them on your side? Drop your ideas below, and while you're at it, let me know where you're watching from today. Oh, and hey, if this story made you smile, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more crazy tales. I've got lots more stories to share, full of heroes, villains, and surprises you'll never see coming. Until next time, keep being awesome, and remember, justice always finds a way. Be brave, be kind, and never, ever let the bullies win. See you soon, story lovers.